I also want to just tell you how excited I am today because this is a long time coming. I've been wanting to do a whole series on the intersection of science and faith because I don't know if you know this, but they're not in competition. And they never really have been, okay? It was when the priest first discovered the Big Bang, the one who did, that wasn't the beginning of it. There's been many other things that have thrown us forward. And the reason I'm telling you this today is because we are so honored to have Phil Leonard come up in just a minute. Or should call him Dr. Phil Leonard, but you're I won't. He is not only someone who loves the Lord, he's also a great speaker. And I think you're really going to love his talk. I'm not going to take up any more of his time. But I want you to open your hearts and hear what he has to say. And if he starts doing too many science stuff, just bear with it because the punchline's the best. Anyway, please welcome my brother and saint of God, Phil.
Thank you very much, Guy. Yeah. You don't need to be the victim of a scientific conference yet. That got 10 years. Am I close enough on the mic, Jenny? I'm going to take silence as a yes. So my name is Phil Leonard. I was a scientist for 13 years, from 2007 till 2020. When I became a program manager, the program I manage is High Explosives and Energetics at Los Alamos National Laboratory. So I am a small cog in a giant machine that ensures that the nuclear deterrent remains intact. So I wasn't born to religion. As a matter of fact, neither of my parents are religious in any way, shape, or form. To call my mother a lapsed Catholic is like calling Satan a lapsed angel, and I think she would appreciate that description. My relationship with my dad is a bit more complicated, but we'll get into that in a minute. So I did not grow up in a believing family, and I wasn't a common sight at the church in my youth. However, I was religious in my own way, because when I was about 5 years old, after my parents had divorced, my dad started reading to me from a book on Greco-Roman mythology. And I became absolutely enthralled in the stories of the gods and the heroes and all of the other characters. The last page in that book, I can still remember vividly, had the broken face of the statue of Zeus lying on the ground. And it said, when the belief of the Romans in their gods diminished, the gods themselves perished. And to my young mind, what that meant was that all gods were mortal, and by extraction, that none of them were real. So, fast forward a few years, I'm 10 years old, driving to the Unitarian Church with my dad, and I asked Dad, I'm an atheist, you're an atheist, why are we going to church? And my dad said, because the women I meet in church are better than the ones I pick up in bars. Now, in deference to my dad, he met his third wife at a dance at that Unitarian church, and she's a lovely person, so it did work out for him. But let's just say that he was more interested in religion for its extracurricular activities. So, as a young boy, I guess most people would say I was big-boned, but in reality, I was just fat. And being fat made me pretty self-conscious. And nevertheless, I was pretty good at academics, and I had a very skeptical, questioning attitude. So when I compared myself to my peer group, who were much thinner and better looking, but apathetically religious, I thought, the one thing I have over them is a line to the real, an understanding of objective reality which they lack because of their devotion to God, or supposed devotion to God. And that really summarizes my prejudice against religion for the next 25 years. Eventually I lost weight, that helped. But nevertheless, I maintained that critical, skeptical attitude toward not just religion, but life in general. And I think that's actually part of the reason that I went into science, because my mind is very good at looking at problems, looking at data, and finding all of the deficiencies in it. This is not always good. This does not always make you popular with your family and wife. All right. So when I talk about science, when I talk about being a scientist, what does that mean? Well, that means that I am a user, sometimes an abuser, of the scientific method. More generally, people are taught that science is an institution, that it's a source of knowledge, and those things are true to an extent. But what science is, in the final analysis, science is a way to quantify the uncertainty about which you know something. So, to give you an example, somebody might think, I think tomorrow is going to be warmer than today. A scientist would say something like, I am 95% confident that tomorrow's high will be between 72 and 74% Fahrenheit, 74 degrees Fahrenheit. What's the difference between those two statements? One of them is qualitative. The other one is appears to be rigorously quantitative. And that is the language of science, the ability to quantify your uncertainties in the things that are under study. As a culture, what makes science unique is the ruthless skepticism that it applies toward all of the hypotheses, experiments, and theories that it undertakes. Because what you are supposed to do in the proper execution of the scientific method is, after you have gone through your set of experiments, you give that data over to a peer, and that peer reviews it for correctness and consistency. I will mention this is very hard to do at the present time due to the massive volume of scientific papers that are funded and that get sent to journals for publication. 200 years ago, when nobody had a printer, it was a lot easier, because printing presses just aren't that fast. Over the years, we've gone through a lot of different theories, and many of them have failed the test of time. So in chemistry, one of my favorite superannuated theories is the plum pudding model, where they thought that electrons, protons, and neutrons just kind of floated around, you know, kind of like a cup of plum pudding. That obviously has been replaced by the nuclear model. But it's that willingness to execute self-criticism that drives science toward the advancement of knowledge. Because without that self-criticism, you can't discard the old. You're stuck in that orthodox way of thinking. By the way, if the theory that you overturn is important enough, they'll give you the Nobel Prize. So that's, you know, the upshot of being a skeptic in the scientific fields. But as it turns out, while I was walking away from God, science was also walking away from its traditions. And Jenny, I don't know if you have this up, but I'm going to go through what the scientific method entails. It starts with observation. Part of observation is defining rigorously all the terms that you're going to use as you describe the parameters in your study. Once you've observed something, you create a hypothesis. So that's where you propose a cause and effect relationship often in order to describe the correlations between the things that you are observing. Then you analyze the data. And frankly, when we go wrong, when we create hypotheses and theories that later fail, it's often because we failed to analyze the data correctly. Either that or our definitions don't live up to the level of rigor that the method demands. Perform error analysis. People like to skip this one, but it's probably the most critical part of execution of the scientific method, because that's what tells you, am I 90% confident, 95% confident? What is my error? Are my errors consistent or are they inconsistent? And finally, you can present a conclusion if, and only if, the data actually supports it. We've completely forgotten that. So how are we doing as a society in implementing science today? Are we using it effectively to confront our problems? Well, let's take a brief look at climate change. And I bring this up because it's important to a lot of people. Well, actually, I would say it's important to everyone. Currently, there's a debate on the extent to which the actions of mankind affect the climate, particularly global surface temperature. So the orthodox view is that the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere traps energy as heat, and that heat then causes heating of the surface. And that's a perfectly reasonable hypothesis because if you look at the IR spectrum of the carbon dioxide molecule, you will see that it is quite effective at absorbing solar radiation. But as a technically adept society, we need to be able to actually test that hypothesis. So first we have to define terms. Jenny, do you have the picture of the train? My wife and I took our honeymoon at the Cumbres Toltec line, and this is one of the pictures that I snapped during that train ride. If you look at this picture, you immediately see one major difficulty in measuring surface temperature, and that is that the surface on Earth is pretty irregular. If I say surface, what do I mean by that? Do I mean the dirt? Do I mean the grass? Do I mean the trees? Do I mean the squirrels in the trees? Do you have to count the squirrels? She might be important. By comparison, if you launch a probe to Mars, the surface is basically a bunch of dead rock. So it's pretty easy to say what you mean by the surface there. If you're rolling a ball down an inclined plane, you can define that ball with great specificity. You know its composition, its mass, its temperature, its hardness, etc. In reality, surface temperature, in the sense that climatologists use it, is actually defined by their method of measurement. So for ancient temperatures, that tends to be oxygen isotopes in old shells and coral. For more recent measurements, last 500,000 years, that's carbon isotope measurements from the Vostok ice core data or other ice core drills. In modern times, we started measuring surface temperature back in the days of the Enlightenment by actually hanging thermometers, usually about 1 meter off the ground, in the shade, hopefully, and reading them over time. But that method is somewhat inadequate in the sense that wars happen and nobody's reading the temperature in the middle of a war in Congo. Right? So there are holes in those data series. Then again, you're not actually measuring the temperature at the surface. You're measuring the temperature of the air over the surface and assuming that those are correlated. We make the same assumption using our satellite data. There are a variety of satellites that measure temperature in different ways. The data that you see most often in the news media is generally from one of the NASA satellites that uses molecular vibrations to measure indirectly the temperature of molecules in that air column. Again, it's making the assumption that the actual surface is reflected by the gas over the surface. Okay. The worst of it's over, guys. Okay, I promise. We're going to get easier from here. So again, that satellite would do a great job if it were floating over Mars. But because it's floating over the Earth, and the surface of the Earth is constantly changing, that's actually a much more difficult correlation to make. Now, we know what will ultimately happen to the Earth. Jenny, if you want to bring up the picture of what planet Earth looks like in a couple billion years. It turns out that solar intensity changes over time. Over the last 4.5 billion years, approximately the lifespan of this planet, the solar intensity has actually increased by 30% as that mixed fission-fusion reactor goes through its cycle. It's going to continue to increase by about 10% every billion years until this planet is a burning chunk in space. So we know what the long term looks like. In the short term, the sun goes through 11-year cycles of sunspot generation, and that definitely has an effect on us, especially when a big solar flare comes and knocks out your internet. A Serbian geophysicist named Milutin Milankovic, I had to write that down, described how the movements of the planets affects the temperature on Earth, particularly in the guise of the formation and end of ice ages. And I think, Jenny, you have a picture of the Milankovitch cycles These involve change in the Earth's orbit, which is actually not very circular, it's more eccentric. The obliquity, or the angle of the Earth's rotation to that orbit, and then the precession of the Earth on that rotational axis. He had a lot of time because he got stuck in jail for a while due to political uncertainties. But he worked all of this out, and the Milankovitch cycles are quite useful in comparing previous ice ages to the motion of the planets. I bring this up because human beings are particularly bad at holding planets in their orbit. So that's one independent variable we're not going to be able to affect. The Earth actively responds to these changes in insolation. That's the amount of light coming in. For one thing, as the oceans warm, they generate more water vapor. The water vapor condenses into clouds. Those clouds reflect light back into space. That's called albedo. So the albedo of the Earth increases. Life also responds to these changes because as the temperature and carbon dioxide concentration increase, plant growth accelerates, especially for large plants like trees. Also phytoplankton, which are kind of an unsung hero in heat regulation on Earth, as that phytochemistry transforms sunlight into cellulose and stored chemical potential energy rather than heat. I told you this was going to get easier, didn't I? Well, I'm a chemist, so I have a different concept of easy, I guess. Large eruptions also cause issues in the sense that the particles that get thrown up into the upper atmosphere also reflect light, thereby increasing the Earth's albedo. And I think we have a picture of Mount St. Helens. You can imagine how all those fine particles spread throughout the atmosphere, how less light actually penetrates to the Earth's surface. Volcanism is particularly problematic because it's totally unpredictable to our science at this time. But the biggest problem, if you are a climatologist, is the fact that temperature is an intensive property, whereas heat is an extensive property. Oh, what does that mean? Okay, let me explain. Imagine that you had a bathtub full of margarita. Calm down, Larry. Calm down. This is just a hypothetical. If you put one ice cube in that bathtub of margarita, would the margarita mix get cold? Not very much, right? That's because the extent of energy represented by the heat of that margarita is more than will overwhelm the amount of energy that the ice can absorb. Okay? But if you took a cup of that margarita mix and poured it into a glass full of ice, then the mass of the ice can absorb more energy and cool down your drink. See, science is important, people, okay? I keep telling you. There are practical applications to this. As you all live out here, you realize that the desert is not good at holding heat. Compare us to a forested area. Trees are massive things. The amount of energy it takes to raise the temperature of 1 gram of wood by 1 degree Celsius, that's called the specific heat, is 2,300 joules. So if you look at an oak tree, a 9,000 kilogram oak tree, it would take 21 megajoules to raise the temperature of that oak tree by 1 degree Celsius. And on cold evenings, as those trees have warmed up over the day, they can give some of that heat energy back, which helps to buffer the cycle of heating and cooling in forested areas. Out here in the desert, well, how many of you have been to the beach on a hot day, stepped on the sand, only to find that it is murderously hot? What happens if you dig your foot under the sand? Yeah. The sand underneath that thin layer on the top is actually quite cool because the sand is an insulator. But that means that the sand can't hold much heat. There isn't much mass of sand that's at that temperature. That's why the temperature in the desert at night cools down so quickly. Both the amount of heat it can hold and the rate at which it can give it back is different from a forest. So lots of things happen on the Earth. You know, rainforests get cut down to make cattle runs in Brazil. Forests expand in northern Europe. The forests in western US burn down in forest fires. The point is that when you have a changing surface on the Earth, the measurement of temperature does not necessarily follow the change in heat. What scientists would like to know about Earth is how much heat is flowing into the system today compared to other time periods. Unfortunately, there is no method to accurately measure that with high frequency, and actually no real method to measure it with high accuracy either. So in short, and unfortunately, temperature is an inadequate dependent variable. The upshot of this problem for us and for policymakers specifically in trying to project or change what we should do is that we can't execute a proper equation of state for the geologic system. Instead, our current climate models use more iterative processes. Now, these run on amazing petaflop machines. They're multi-physics models that can take into account a slew of variables. But essentially what they're doing is matrix algebra over and over and over again to give short-run predictions and then build on one another. The climate system is chaotic, meaning that one variable affects another. Like I said before, the heat affects the growth rate of plants. Carbon dioxide affects the growth rate of other phytogenic organisms. So we can't necessarily, or at least we can't with high confidence and accuracy, determine how all of those independent variables affect one another. And what has been noticed over the last 20 years is that our climate models tend to overpredict increases in temperature. And they also don't tend to model variability as well, or they don't tend to measure variability compared to the signals that they are supposed to estimate. Nevertheless, and this is really the point of my talk, if you ask my family members, my friends, all they read in the news is the top line number. Let's say that the IPCC has projected a 1.5 centigrade increase by the end of this century. They are essentially reading these documents devotionally and uncritically. And that is not how scientific documents are supposed to be read. They're supposed to be read for the purpose of discussion by criticizing the methods and by improving them over time. That is really how science progresses. And while I'm on this topic, science is not a system of beliefs. Science is a method. It is a process to achieve increases in knowledge. Science has no beliefs. I would go so far as to say that belief is anathema to science, regardless of what it might be, because science requires the agility to question our assumptions and our conclusions. The eruption of the Eyjafjallajökull volcano in Iceland was blamed on deviation of many of the atmospheric models from the signal that they were supposed to predict. That underscores what I am trying to tell you about the fragility of all of the acts of man, including our models and our scientific methods. Because if you can't predict volcanism, then the rest of your predictions that are based on that series of events becomes imperiled. So let's compare, Jenny, if you have the strict adherence to the scientific method to what climatologists ultimately accomplished. My criticisms are they failed to define their observables, such as the surface. They couldn't measure the same thing twice in a row because the surface of the Earth was changing right underneath their satellites. They failed to measure the desired observable, which is heat, not temperature. And they were not capable of isolating any of the confounding independent variables. They couldn't tell the sun to stop making sunspots. They couldn't tell the Earth to stop generating volcanoes. And I don't think we'll be changing our orbit anytime soon. That is okay. And I am not trying to contradict either the methods that NASA used or the conclusions to which they came. I am simply pointing out that the scientific method is limited in its remit, and it is not applicable to most of the problems that face the United States or the globe in general today. So we have to do our best with what we have, implementing scientific instruments, often using scientific statements, but we have unfortunately been separated from the scientific method as an effective method for the increase in knowledge. And that's not new. In reality, out of the 1,000 or so nuclear tests that were run by the United States, we never had 2 experiments that were only different by 1 variable. Those experiments were too precious, and the designers had too many cool things that they wanted to bring in. We always changed more than 1 thing at a time. Effectively, the scientific method was just too difficult, or at least too expensive to apply in that case. So we gave up on that univariate methodology. As far as myself, I told you that I'm a critical thinker. I hope I've demonstrated that. Been pretty critical so far. It was that critical skepticism that brought me to God. And it was a very unusual path. I've always been interested in literature, particularly the Bible. I started reading the history of the Bible as told by an agnostic scholar of Christian antiquity called Bart Ehrman. All of his books are fairly similar, and what they all say is that instead of reading the Bible devotionally, if you read it through a critical, skeptical lens, it will allow you to tease out some of the controversies that were ongoing during the 1st and 2nd century of early Christianity. And they're interesting. That's not what I took from his books, though, as the main point. Because for the first 35 years of my life, I had never read anything devotionally. I read technical treatises, and I read works of fiction because I was forced to in English class. But I read nothing devotionally. So the realization that I could read something devotionally was a great advancement for me. And I took the opportunity to just start reading scriptures in that frame of mind. What I immediately realized is that the Pauline doctrine, salvation of faith alone, was one of the most beautiful things that one person could believe in. And somehow that had escaped my notice for over 3 decades. Many things that we know to be true come from a deeper level of knowing than just what we can pencil out on the back of an envelope. The first time that I saw my wife, Jamie, I knew that I loved her, and I didn't need to do any calculations to figure that out. As I read through the Bible, particularly looking back at some of the quotes that Dr. Ehrman had used, I found that they truly resonated with me, particularly quotes like, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." What Jesus is here saying is that you have to come to faith through belief in the resurrection. But to me, on a metaphorical level, it means that no one can achieve complete knowledge through reason alone. Science, by design, is without faith. But belief is the acceptance of things that we know to be true in the total lack of evidence. For so many Americans, their confidence in their political institutions has been shaken by recent events. It feels like our laws, values, and culture are being uprooted daily. And I worry what people will do when they find that the infallibility of the scientific method has been undermined by the incentives of scientific institutions. If faith in God has been replaced by faith in man, what will become of us when we are inevitably found wanting? Science is a tool of limited remit. It is not a belief system and therefore cannot replace a belief system. Science has no values. It is the relentless and remorseless pursuit of factual accuracy without consideration or affection toward old theories or beliefs. And sadly, as soon as you remove that critical element from science and replace it with a sedate orthodoxy, the discipline loses most of its potency. In the 19th century, Friedrich Nietzsche lamented that God is dead. He clearly and brilliantly envisioned what would become in the age of nihilism to come. From where I sit, I can see that science is dying. And I shudder to think of what that passing will do to a technocratic and self-doubting America. The preeminent mathematician Ludwig von Neumann took the skeptical view of the world as far as humanly possible. It's reported that at one point he sat down with the Joint Chiefs and told them that he had conducted a thorough review of the geopolitical situation using game theory, and he had come to the conclusion that a nuclear war between the United States and Russia was inevitable. Therefore, he suggested, we should conduct a first strike. Happily, they ignored him. The so-called godless communists on the other side of the divide were usually more afraid of us than we were of them, and they never had any real intention of starting a nuclear war. In point of fact, several of their submarine captains disobeyed orders in order to de-escalate heated situations. What von Neumann could not have calculated was that the soldiers on both sides of the ideological divide had a love for mankind and a faith in humanity that could not be overcome. Love, it turns out, is even more difficult to manipulate mathematically than temperature. Reading from 1 Corinthians 13. If I speak in tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am only a ringing gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have absolute faith so as to move mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor and exult in the surrender of my body, but have not love, I gain nothing. While those words are not true in a literal sense, they are true in an absolute sense. The 24/7 media outlets surround us with clanging gongs and prophecies. If you try to figure out what the future of the stock market is, they'll give you contradictory prophecies. Half of them will say it's about to crash, half of them will say it's going to 5,000. Sadly, they do nothing to reaffirm our affection for each other, because I think most of the major news outlets calculate higher profits from strife and discord. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It is not rude. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no account of wrongs. Love takes no pleasure in evil, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things. If that does not remind you of your ex, that's because this passage is talking about the love of God. And all you need to do to benefit from the love of God is open yourself to it. It is that to which I was closed for the majority of my 43 years on this planet. Love never fails, but where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they will be restrained. Where there is knowledge, it will be dismissed. For we know in part and we prophesy in part, but when the perfect comes, the partial passes away. I pursued partial understanding for most of my life, and I found it unsatisfying. As I climbed up the scientific ladder, I found nothing there except for the limits. Science can tell you the limits of what you can do. It cannot tell you what you should do, because science has no value system. When I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I set aside childish ways. Now we see but a dim reflection as in a mirror. Then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part. Then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. So I'm nearly 44 years old, and I don't think I fully know myself yet. but I turned my back on a values system that was based only on personal gain and self-gratification. Today I take lessons from my 6-year-old boy in the simple joy of experiencing the world as if I had new eyes. But it will not be until the day I lay down my last glass for the last time that I will fully know what this world was that I left behind. And now these three remain: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. That, I know, is true. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in today. If you were blessed by this message at all, then be a blessing and give to the work of the Lord at eldoradochurch.org.